I'm Dan White. I'm the producer of this show, Chamber TV. I'm the president of the West Nova Chamber of Commerce. And I have a really interesting interview for you today. I'm with Jill Balser. She's our MLA for the Digby Annapolis region, and we're going to get to know her better. And you are?
I'm Jill Balser, and I am the MLA for Digby Annapolis, and I am also the minister responsible for the Department of Labor, Skills and Immigration, as well as minister responsible for the status of women.
Cool. So tell me a little bit about Jill before we get into the MLA part.
Okay.
So what's Jill all about?
Oh gosh, well, I guess I can start with my childhood, because I'm born and raised in Digby, and I think that is something that's really, really important for me now, more than ever perhaps, in this particular role, to really embrace that, of who I am and where I come from.
Right.
And being the middle daughter, I was one of the three Balser girls. That's what we were famously known for. My parents, of course, were Wendy and Gordon, who were also community advocates and developers in a way that I didn't realize growing up. Being two educators, they knew the community inside and out.
Cool.
And I think, again, being able to say that legacy is now one, of course, of my dad's that I'm going to try to carry on as best as I possibly can. But it's the roots in the history of family that really means something. And yeah, so I'm born and raised in middle daughter, and the one with the personality is how my parents would describe me.
Okay. So you mentioned Digby. What's your perception of Digby Annapolis? How do you see our community?
Oh gosh. I see this area as one that has incredible, incredible people. And actually, in preparation for our conversation today, my mom and I, of course, have been going through a lot of my dad's old things. And we came across an old videotape of my dad's maiden speech in the legislature.
Oh, wow.
And he spoke about the residents of Digby Annapolis. And in his remarks, which is everything that I have channeled and embraced in a way that I didn't even realize, but it's an area of incredibly proud people. It's an area of incredibly hard-working people. And in his reference, he also said, a handshake is how you can seal a deal. Your word is so valuable, it can mean everything. And when I think of my childhood then, I saw that in every aspect of anything that I did, whether it was playing sports, whether it was activities through my local church, whether it was getting involved in volunteering, or even witnessing the work of my parents in their role in the education system. It's all about supporting one another. Now, of course, it's an area that has its challenges, but the people are incredibly proud and have the ability and do come up with solutions and drive that change forward themselves.
Interesting. Now, I've heard it said that people in Digby Annapolis don't like change. Do you think that's true?
Well, I think there's an essence of maybe, and I think that goes for everyone, to be honest. I think everyone in Nova Scotia has a bit of that pride and protection of we like things the way that they are, but Nova Scotia is a changing province, and there is no way that we can deny that.
That's right.
So going back to sort of my upbringing, because when I was young, we as young people were told you have to leave this area in order to be successful. There was even a study that was called the Brain Drain that spoke to local fishermen and community along Digby Neck that talked about if you stay in Digby, you're going to be a fisherman basically.
Right.
Or you're going to work in the fishing industry.
Right.
And you're never going to leave. But
Right.
if you have been either identified or have the opportunity to leave, you should. And that to me was just absolutely appalling. To think that that's how outsiders would perceive our community, but even more disheartening is that how people felt about ourselves. And so now, when I moved back home, it was in 2015, and I started working at the YMCA. And I was a part of a pilot project under the previous government to support newcomers in rural communities. And I think that's when I started to realize some of the barriers for newcomers, especially those who were coming from an international immigration or as a refugee. That perhaps maybe the language supports weren't there, or the connections to culture weren't there. But even just going to the grocery store and trying to find something that is an essence of home, it was quite challenging.
It would be.
But now, to see an international aisle in the superstore and in our grocery chains here in Digby is incredible. To see a thriving Ukrainian community that is now living in Cornwallis Park, but seeing immigrants coming and supporting our businesses and having more and more employers come to me and my Department of Immigration and say, how can we be better? How can we be more welcoming, and how can we support people so that they become part of the community and really authentically feel that?
Well, that's cool. What effect are you seeing from all the people coming into Nova Scotia? I think it's over 20,000 a year.
Yeah, well, actually, so when I was appointed as minister responsible for immigration, I think I jumped through the roof and I almost fell off the floor, and I didn't hear what the premier said to me when it was the rest of my title. It was just more immigration, and I thought, oh my goodness. And one thing that makes me so incredibly proud is my team has said, because of my previous experience working in the front lines, I was an immigrant settlement worker. Okay. So you could see how challenging as an immigrant it could be to connect to community, but even understand the immigration streams. It is challenging. Sure. And when you think about someone who is ready to uproot their life and move to a new area where they may not have connections, but they want to have a better life for themselves and their family, we have to appreciate that, and we have to give as much support as we possibly can. Yeah. So anytime that I have a chance to give a shout out to the YMCA, I absolutely do, because honestly, if it wasn't for the Y, I wouldn't have understood what community really means. Yeah. And I wouldn't have understood what a sense of belonging really meant. Yeah. And so now that's what I champion in the work that I do as the MLA and as a minister, because yes, immigration, we're going to see some challenges of population growth. And we are, and we're feeling those pressures. But I think what's really important is for people to understand that together, governments, all level, community organizations, we can plan for that. Yeah. It's not, the pressures of immigration are not causing some of those systemic issues that we're seeing. Yeah. It is, and it takes people many years to also decide to move to a new place. It doesn't happen overnight.
Well, in some cases it's overnight.
Well, in some cases, yes. And I think that's also what's really important, because we also have people, and we saw it after COVID and even before COVID, looking at Nova Scotia as a destination of choice and saying, this is where I want to be. That look at what the province has to offer, the pristine lifestyle, all of the wonderful things that we as Nova Scotians knew, but sometimes take for granted or don't appreciate until someone with a new perspective can say, do you realize how amazing it is here?
That's right. That's right.
So, and I think when you categorize, population growth, we have to think about interprovincial migration too, because it's not just international immigration.
That's right.
Yeah.
So tell me, what's a day in the life of Jill Balser at work look like? What do you do?
Oh gosh. Well, I'd have to say it depends on the day, it depends on the week.
Right.
But one thing, I try to be in the constituency as often as I possibly can. So my schedule usually is me here on Mondays and Fridays, running around to every event, every festival, every possible thing that I can go to on the weekends. And I have my department responsibilities, so I need to be in Halifax too. So I tend to plan my time in Halifax from Tuesday to Thursday.
Right.
Yeah.
So to share with me what it's actually like.
What it's like?
What's it like? You get up in the morning and you come in and
I mean, it can be that sometimes, but honestly, Dan, waiting for you and hearing some of the comments that have already come through, like it's the volume of work is high, and I'd say that managing everything, I know that I don't always get it right, but to have an incredible team behind me and with me is so important, because the workload is never ending. But one thing that I have championed and said to my team, whoever comes through that door is the priority in that moment. And so we have to treat everyone with respect. And you also just never know what's going to happen. And actually, something that the Premier had said to us as very, very new MLAs, you have to make sure that anybody, you just don't know what's going on in their life at that point in time. So when someone's going to come to an MLA office, it's probably going to be the last resort, or they're going to be at that point of desperation where I'm going to get evicted from my apartment and I have nowhere to go. There are some really complex challenges that we have to, again, drop everything and say, how do we support this individual right now? And what does my office have the capability to influence, change, and actually do? And sometimes it's dissecting, is it a policy evaluation that we have to look at? If it's in my department, is it a decision that I can make as a minister to change it? Or does it have to go through some of the other decision-making channels, like an ask to Treasury Board, or an ask to cabinet. So sometimes there are pieces that take a little bit of longer time, but sometimes it's also what can we do right now?
Yeah.
But in the day in the life, it could be anything from someone calling and asking about, I heard about that heat pump program, how do I get an application?
Yeah.
Or again, it could be something of the magnitude of a housing ask or navigating the healthcare system.
Yeah.
But it's just a constant be ready for anything because you just
Yeah.
never know what you might have to support someone with.
Yeah. Well, I like what you said. So let's pretend that I walk in through the door and I
Yep.
say, Jill, I've got a problem, I've been evicted. How
Yes.
can you help me?
Oh gosh. Well, that's one thing that we turn to for is the support of local agencies. And looking to, okay, we have to tackle this like a problem, but
Yeah.
a puzzle piece.
Yeah.
So what did the eviction letter say? When did you receive it? Trying to understand the intricacies of the tenancy board and the rights of the tenant and the landlord. So navigating some of that, because sometimes like as a person, again, who gets this eviction letter, you're gonna look at that and go, what do I do? So there is a state of panic and desperation and also just trying to figure it out. And if you're in that place, you need someone to help guide you to say it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's what my office can provide. And that might be the only thing that we can provide.
Yeah.
But we have a list of landlords in the area. We work very closely with the housing agency. We've got the Middleton office on speed dial. We have, and again, back to the local community organizations, because depending on what the need might be, the support and resources could actually be through a community organization. And I say that as an example for now thinking about my role as responsible for the status of women. Let's say it's an individual fleeing a domestic violent relationship. There is local supports to be able to support that individual for their unique needs. So that might be a call to Juniper House and say, there's this individual, this is what they need, how can you help? There is a shelter for women, and it is in Yarmouth, unfortunately, but there are ways to get somebody to a safe place as quickly as possible.
That's really good, and that's an important issue. But it brings up a thought in my mind. It's
Sure.
because I've ended up consulting with a lot of people going through acrimonious breakups, and I'm watching and seeing the dynamics. And sometimes it's one side or the other, but usually it's more often that a woman will attack the man's character over the children, and it gets when you're looking at it from the outside, you're saying, do I believe this person? And what's the truth? So do you get involved in those situations here? Because you talked about abuse, and sometimes it's real and occasionally it's not, and that really hurts the credibility of the people where it is real. And I'm wondering, you brought it up, so I thought, that's something that
Well, I think in any case where there's someone who is experiencing violence, it's getting them to a safe place as quickly as possible.
Agreed.
And I think that's where we really have to rely on the expertise of those who know the social justice system, know the Department of Justice, know how to respond to a traumatic situation.
Yeah.
And that's where, again, a call to Juniper House would be the first call that I would make if I had experienced that. Fortunately enough, we haven't had that type of issue here at the constituency office, but I know that it happens across the province. And I know that there are families that are experiencing this. And given the severity of the issue of domestic violence and how it is growing, not only here in our province, but nationally, we have to work together with all levels of government. So one thing that I was really proud of is Nova Scotia signing the Gender-Based Violence National Action Plan with the federal government. And it's putting investments in community. So that when a situation arises, an individual can get that support, and if it has to go to the courts to be determined what the further outcome is going to be, well then that's where it needs to go. It shouldn't be government weighing in on a particular situation, but I think importantly, does government have policies in place to protect victims and making sure that they know what supports are out there for them.
So do you think that women that are being abused know that they can come here for help, for guidance?
I hope so.
Okay,
and that's probably a great point to be able to take back to some of those national conversations that I'm having. So fortunately, the federal, provincial, and territorial meetings on the status of women are happening in a week's time. So I will be there with my colleagues to talk about our action plan, but what Nova Scotia's provincial action plan happens to be, but then also learning from each other. So that's where I think that this true spirit of learning and engagement and cooperation, even at the national level, because that's something that I hear sometimes. It's, I do have the privilege of being a minister, and then it's like, well, what else do you do?
That's
well, you have to engage with your colleagues and look at what other jurisdictions are doing that we could potentially implement here in Nova Scotia.
That sounds really good. Thank you for that. So can you think of a highlight of your job, something you've achieved that you feel really good about?
Oh gosh, there's so many successes that happen in the run of the day, and sometimes they can be overshadowed by some of the negativity. And I try really hard to focus on, okay, what was the thing that happened today that made me really happy, or what was the thing that I can celebrate? And honestly, one that comes to mind is the opening of the Digby Splash Park. When I was invited to be there, and Sharon McAlpine and the whole entire team were just so sweet to make sure that they worked around my schedule so that I could be there for part of the celebration. But I knew that I wasn't the highlight of the event by any means. It was more for the families and the volunteers who were involved in making that happen. And so when I can think of a very clear, here's what we need you to do as the MLA, Jill. We need $300,000 to make this thing possible. We're already fundraising. There's a committee of people who are so determined and said, we're going to make this happen, and it's going to happen in a few years' time, because that community champion spirit was there. So for me, I was able to raise that with my colleague in the Department of Community, Culture, Tourism, and Heritage to say, there is an ask. I don't know where the decision making is going to take place, but for me to say, I can do that. I can champion this cause. And the province I was able to present a check of $300,000 to the committee.
That's big.
Right?
That's big. Good for you.
And so to be there at the opening and have it, well, it wasn't just me, it was Mayor Ben Cleveland as well, having a bucket of water dump on our heads. With all the children running around, it was such a highlight, such a highlight.
That's cool. Now, in the real world, there's also those days where you get stuff that's hard to deal with. Give me an example of that.
Of course. Well, actually, one, of course, with the recent floodings that our area has experienced. So knowing that there was significant rainfall, roads were washed out. There were, of course, you probably saw too, and I know that community members were commenting on some of the videos that were posted to Facebook. I think of Frank and Doris as an example, and knowing sometimes it can be really hard because that culvert was one that my office was working really hard to advance. But also knowing the complexities were quite hard to work around. But then, of course, and this is what I hear a lot of, is does it unfortunately take a situation like that to happen before government responds? And unfortunately, in some cases it may, but in others it's also, we were trying to get there. So let's look at what needs to be done. Let's figure out a plan moving forward. I was so pleased to find out that the tender for that project has gone out. So there are those little successes. So going back to the, okay, at least that happened. So this is a challenge because we have to look at how are we as a province going to prepare for increased rainfall. And I even think, of course, this isn't the first time our province has seen it. We've had two summers of that type of weather pattern happen. And even knowing the road work that's happening out in Shore Road, I met with the town and went to see the work that was being done, and trying to again figure out my role as the MLA is to advocate for what the town needs. Knowing that is going to be an expensive project that had to be done, I have to work with the town and go to my colleagues and say, we have to work to make sure that the work gets done and it gets done quickly. But then also, how can we work together to plan? Because we know that this type of weather pattern isn't going to go away. So now it comes into the short term, and breaking things down sometimes can be really helpful to say, okay, project done, but what's the policy of the province going forward? How are we going to work together to start thinking about our changing environment?
Cool. So there's an election coming up.
Well, it will come up at some point.
Well, my guess is they would recess the legislature for 6 months if they weren't planning for an election.
Well, we our legislative sittings happen twice a year. So we usually go in the fall and we go in the spring.
Yeah, but it's
Yeah.
not usually 6 months, is it?
Well, in my time as MLA, usually the fall sitting will happen sometime between September and October, and the spring session can start as early as February, which we went in February last sitting until about April.
Yeah. So obviously you'll run again.
So yes, I'm very, very pleased and proud to say that my nomination went through, and I am the PC candidate once again for Digby Annapolis.
So that's good. So you're
Yeah.
going to hit the ground running. That's what they call the thing.
Yeah.
So is there anything else you'd like to tell our viewers about anything you want to say?
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, for the fact that yes, there's a lot of talk about an election coming up, and we do know that this is going to be a year of 3 elections. So I think for residents to really start looking at issues that are important to them, paying attention to what candidates are saying, you know, looking at party platforms, and one thing that's super important is to get out and vote. Get out and vote. And knowing we've got a municipal election coming up in the fall, that might be the first one. And so if it is, get informed on municipal issues. And then, of course, the next 2 that follow, doing the same thing. So I guess what I would like to say is it has been an absolute honor to be the MLA for Digby Annapolis, for a riding that I truly love and adore. And I don't think I would have ever done it if it hadn't been for me moving back home and being reconnected to my community and where I come from. And I know I have to say this because, of course, my dad was very influential on my decision, but he never pushed me. Never pushed me. I think if it was his way, it would have been, no, you'll never do this. But I think he realized once it was happening, there was no backing it down, and instead he stood by my side every step of the way. But it has been an honor of my life. And one thing that he said to me right away, this will be the hardest job that you ever do, and it will be the hardest that you ever work, but the work is so important and you have to give it everything you've got.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. It's been
Thank
a pleasure.
you. Oh, thanks, Dan. It's been great. Thank you.
This was fun.